Okay, in keeping with the horror theme, check out this lighting. This is just a quick intro. This is an interview with my friend Matt Steele. We were at the Dead of Winter Horror Invitational, which is something he puts on every year in the Gold Country in Northern California. He's a fantastic horror GM, and I wanted to ask him some questions about how he runs one-shots in particular of horror games. And we touched on some other things as well. I hope you like it. I did not keep my voice in on this recording because I sounded like a frog on some sort of helium, and my voice is really cracked. So I removed that. You'll also hear occasionally a sound or two from the background humming of the machinery in this old hotel. But hopefully it's a worthwhile video. Let me know what you think.
I started gaming in 1980, and I had the good fortune of, when I first started gaming, I had the good fortune of meeting up with a couple of guys who, I was in high school, they were in college, and one of them had graduated from college, so they managed to, they had a little bit of money, and one of them was very into every game that came out. So I have a very different history than a lot of other people in gaming, which is that I played a lot of different games. I didn't start with one game, stick with that, and then have that be my game for years and years. So I have a long history of doing that. Very quickly, I moved into the GM chair because storytelling is my interest. Like everything I'm interested in is around storytelling. So it was a natural place for me to migrate in my gaming. So pretty much right away, I started running games, running Gamma World, running Traveler, running all kinds of things that came out at that time. Yes, I go to 3 or 4 conventions every year. Generally, it means it's going to have elements that we recognize from other types of horror media, right? So there's going to be some sort of creepy factor. There's potentially going to be some sort of supernatural factor. But you could be doing sci-fi horror, so you might have body horror, but you're going to recognize it from other media, right? From writing, from movies, from TV series. Like you're going to see the same things that are, that fit the horror genre all over. For me, kind of the definition of horror is when, regardless of the setting, the universe doesn't work the way that you expect it to work, that it begins to go wrong, or you learn that it doesn't operate the way that you think it does. And that breaks people from their comfortable reality. And that's, for me, a key element of horror. So I have a working theory that you can't run a horror game in a fantasy setting. And my working theory goes something like this. In a setting where the supernatural, magic, and things like vampires, werewolves, the undead, skeletons, are just a part of the world, it's hard to take those sort of things and make them horror. They might be scary in the moment, right? But they're not what I mentioned a minute ago. They're not the world behaving different than you expect it to behave, right? You know that they're skeletons. You know that they can be fought with a sword and killed. So it's not horror when you encounter them. I mean, I've actively been trying to prove that wrong, including running some fantasy games, which isn't my key genre. Yes, by and large, people will move around a little bit within the area. I think to some degree, GMs gravitate toward the things that they feel competent doing, right? That they're interested in, right? That they have knowledge in. But if like me and like you, right, you run and play a lot of different games, right? Eventually you find things that resonate with you, where you're like, oh, this particular setting, this particular game, this this genre or set of genres are things that are very natural for me. Like I said, I've as part of this experiment, I've been running fantasy games, and I find it difficult to actually talk in the way, as the GM, to say fantasy things, to say like, oh, there's some scary elves in the woods. And I just find it funny, like right away. And I'm trying to set up some other situation, and I can't take my own narration seriously just because fantasy for me doesn't resonate the same way horror does or science fiction does. So I think to some degree, it's, where GMs they're finding the things that they really like and enjoy, and then feel that they do well. Yeah, because you can run a body horror game, right? That feels like very personal to some degree, right? You can you can run an Aliens game, right, which is essentially a body horror game, right? And like that can feel really intense, and like you can get like emotionally invested in a game like that. And then you could run like Ghostbusters, which is horror comedy, right? Mm-hmm. There's still horror elements in it, right? But that's very broad, right? And you can run like some really hardcore horror game that's very intense. Yeah. So you can there's such a wide range of things that you can do just within that genre too. Yeah. So structurally, one of the things that I try and do in a horror game is get as early as possible some sort of emotional buy-in, right? So setting buy-in, of course, right, but also emotional buy-in. So I'll give an example. So I'm moving away from the example that you're using. So I ran a scenario that I created that I called the Kings of New York. So 1920s Call of Cthulhu in New York. All the player characters were the head of very low-level gangs in New York. And a guy comes to town and says, hey, I can make you kings of New York, but you're going to have to do some things for me. And while he's having this conversation, they're all seated around this round table. And not only do I say to them, he's walking around behind you, I got up out of the chair and walked around behind them, right? So like I'm creating this tension as I go, describing like what can happen to these characters. And then I say at one point, there's some other gang members here, or like heads of other smaller gangs. And I said, and then at one point, he just reaches over and slams this guy's head into the table, right? And when I say that, I slam my hand down on the table, right, which startles everybody. And suddenly, like he's murdering this guy in front of them. They're gang people, so like murder's not that shocking to them, but then the table begins to absorb the blood. That's just coming out of this guy's face, right? So I'm buying, like, in that very moment, like the emotional buy-in of the players and the player characters, because as I said, earlier, like suddenly the universe doesn't work the way that they thought it did, right? Oh yeah, horrible gang guy, and I'm using real space to also augment that. So that combination of things gives me this emotional buy-in, and then I'm looking at so where am I going to take them? Like what's the ride that I'm going to take them on? And often when I'm crafting a scenario, I actually start at the end. I want to know what the end state is going to be. Is it going to be like a moral decision that they're going to have to make at the end? Is it going to simply be very clear good guys, bad guys, and there's a lot of difficulty overcoming whatever is there, right? But I want to get them to the point where when they get to that finale, it's going to feel satisfying, difficult, all of those things, and I want to carry that emotional thread all the way through. So what I'm looking for is how to carry that emotional thread from one end to the other, so that the two things connect smoothly. So when we get to the end, they really feel the power of what I cooked up at the beginning. And in horror, there are certain things that as a GM, and you see this a lot in horror, but if you're not studying it, like it doesn't become obvious. So isolation is a big deal in horror, right? Like, especially if you're running anything modern, right? You want to take away the player character's cell phones as soon as possible, right? So they're not just spending a bunch of time looking things up, because that's not very interesting. Though you may want to give them a bunch of information that way to help, so that they have a bunch of information and they can decide like where the story's going. The other thing is it can be really useful to look at the story points, the plot points that you want in the story, and build into a one-shot scenario an openness that allows the player characters to find those plot points, not necessarily in a specific order, right? But like, what's the information that they need to get to that big satisfying end conclusion? All right, they're going to need to get some information, or they're going to need to understand what the horror is about. So giving the players enough freedom to make choices where they can go in a bunch of different directions and pick up the information and the points that they need to carry them through the story. Yeah, so part of it is really describing the setting, and in doing that, describing kind of how gritty it is. Also, one of the techniques, and I got this from Todd Furler, who's another great GM, right, is I will often frame something in terms of what's the tone based on like what is the kind of movie that we're making, right? What is the story that we're doing together, right? Because in its best iteration, role-playing games are collaborative storytelling. Yep. What kind of story are we playing, right? If we're playing a story that's going to have probably some high lethality, that's going to be pretty brutal, like we just talk about that up front, so that there's a clear understanding around the table, like this is this kind of game, right? Like, yeah, depending on which game it is. And again, because there's such variety, like, not every horror game needs to end with the final girl. So the biggest thing that I want is exactly what we just talked about, is for everyone to buy in and understand what is the type of thing that we're doing, right? So that we can stay on tone, by and large, so that as we're playing through the story, we're maintaining kind of the feel of what it is that we're doing. So that's really what I'm looking for when I sit down. The other thing that in terms of making the story itself play out and having the tone be consistent, one of the things that I think about a lot is making sure that I position the players and inform the players so that they're playing the kind of game that I want to run. Right, so that we're all on the same page of like, this is the kind of game that I'm going to run, so this is the game that I hope you want to play, right? So that as we're moving along, that we're all sort of in agreement on this is the kind of story that we're telling. This is the kind of look and feel of it. That's one of the first things I look for. The other thing is, especially at a game convention, I'm looking to see if there is rules familiarity at the table, and if there are other GMs at the table. Because those are my potential allies at the table, right? If I'm having to explain the rules to every single player all of the time through the course of a one-shot, that slows things down, right? And it pulls people out of the experience, all of those things, like or less, make the game a little less effective potentially, right? So if I've got another GM at the table who has rules familiarity, I can lean on them to help players sitting next by while I'm doing something else, while I'm preparing something, or I'm not stopping the game all the time. If somebody has a question, I can say, hey, can you explain that to me?
Right.
So I'm looking for GMs and experienced players at the table, also so that I can judge how much I have to explain to people at the beginning of the game. Because you're using up time, like in a one-shot at a convention, you're using all those rules explanation, setting explanation, all those things eat up time that you don't get to, that you don't get to play through the story. So I'm looking for those allies to help make that game experience better. And if they're sitting right there and they're willing to jump in, then right away, like that game experience is going to be better. The other thing about having another GM at the table is GMs like understand how games work, and so they will do a couple of things. One, they'll go where the story goes, and they're not trying to fight where the story goes. So they will find a reason for their character to move with the story. The other thing that GMs do that's awesome is they will find less experienced or slightly reticent players at the table and help draw them out, help them get involved in the story, because they can see that they're sitting back a little bit. And some players are more comfortable being, doing that way, but a GM also knows when they try and engage with that player and they still step back, that's how they want to engage with the game.
Right.
And it's also very important at game conventions. When you run at the same convention, you have friends who are in your game, right? And it's tricky. I've been at tables where I'm the only person at the table who's not friends with the GM. And you can feel very isolated if everyone else seems to have this common language and I'm not really invited in. And if you've got 3 people who are friends with the GM and 2 people who, this is the first time ever sitting down with you, right? That dynamic can feel off.
Sure.
But a GM will recognize that and engage those other players and include them. And now you can reduce that dynamic to make the experience around the table that much better. So, yeah, those are the main things that I'm looking at every kind of game I run. Two quick points. One, a lot of people are reluctant to play horror games because a particular type of horror doesn't appeal to them, right? If you like an emotionally engaging game, I would say look toward horror games because they can be very emotionally engaging.
Right.
And that leads to my second point, which is one of the reasons I like horror is horror in terms of games and movies is not about how people function when things are going great. Right? They're not about being heroic. They're not about being champions. They're about how does a person respond when things go really wrong, right? When the world around you falls apart and things are scary. And that's really deeply emotionally engaging. So those elements of horror, I think, are missed sometimes when people are like, oh, I don't like things that are scary and bloody. There's, as we said earlier, there's such a broad range of horror games that you can play that don't delve into a lot of areas that might seem super bloody or whatever it is that kind of repels you from horror games. And ultimately, tension is what makes a great horror game, right? I was having this discussion with someone earlier. I've run some pretty good horror games, I think, in my time. And my goal is never to scare the player. I don't want the player to be afraid. Right? And I don't think I've ever scared a player, right? I mean, it's possible, but yeah. I want the characters to be afraid. Right? That's where I want the fear to happen. And the tension is the same kind of tension that you have when you're watching a horror movie and you know that the killer is out there, and you see the people, and they don't know that the monster is out there or the killer is out there, right? You're tense for them. And that tension is what makes a really interesting horror game. Is you are afraid for the player characters, but as a player you're not afraid because nothing's going to happen to you, right? You can separate those things out, but if you can build that tension, like, that's a great horror game.